So this lecture is on constructivism, and constructivism should primarily be seen as an approach to international relations and less so as a theory. Unlike liberal internationalism and realism, it's not concerned with the pursuit of power, um, modes of cooperation, and it rather says that all of these theories really have minimized the power of ideas. Ideas matter, identities matter. In fact, they have shaped and continue to shape international relations. So if you look at American society, just at that level of analysis, and then even within American society, look at different professional association, a lawyers association, bar association, teachers association, uh, different professional association, all of which will have industry standards by which they measure their performance, which also regulates their behavior, their practices, their norms. And that is true for any society at large, that we have the so-called industry standards of how we interact with one another. What is considered acceptable behavior? What is considered antisocial behavior, for example? So society in turn shapes our actions and words and creates rules. It impacts, these ideas impact and transform also the organization of international relations. So just like inside a society, ideas, identities have a huge impact on how international relations are being conducted. States themselves, they debate their own national identity. Who are we? Where do we belong? And how do we fit in that, what is called the international community? So this is a recurring theme, not only in a society, but in fact, identities, ideas have an impact on the conduct of international relations. Rules here in particular, they tell us who the key players are in a given situation, they instruct, direct, and commit actors to take certain actions. So largely it is a social theory, and it looks at how to conceptualize the relationship between agents and structures. And at the bottom line, the very premise is that we are looking at a social construction of reality. Now we have very hard facts, looking that we need oxygen to breathe for life on Earth. We're looking at gravity. These are non-disputable facts. And then we're looking at social facts. Social facts are really dependent on a human agreement. Looking at money as a way of circulating means and supply and demand in a capitalist economy. Refugees. What is a refugee? How do we define a refugee, and what sort of duties do states have to accept refugees that are fleeing persecution? Human rights, the whole concept of human rights is dependent on agreement. In fact, you need to become, as a state, accede to certain human rights conventions. And of course, sovereignty. Again, sovereignty, coming back to the Treaty of Westphalia, it wasn't until these rulers decided, let's think about sovereignty, autonomy, and territory. These were the foundations, then became the foundations of contemporary international relations. So these are all social facts that are dependent on a human agreement. Much like at the state level in a society, it also depends on agreement between states at the international level. So over time, rules, practices can form a stable pattern that serve the interests of key agents in international relations. And these patterns eventually become institutions. They become accepted by everyone in international relations. And as you can see, these ideas change. New ideas are being introduced. Alexander Wendt, a famous scholar in constructivist theory, wrote, "Anarchy is what states make of it." So and the premise here is that the international system does not need to result in competition, security dilemmas, arms race, or conflict, like many realists would argue, but on the contrary, states have plenty of options. We are only limited by rules, practices, and institutions that they themselves have created. Nobody else has created it for them. Nobody else forces them to engage in these practices. So how a country reacts to anarchy really reflects its particular understanding of that particular condition. So here, ideas shape states' assessments and reactions to power. Looking at India, Pakistan, these are two countries which are in a state of war, de facto war. They're not engaged in fighting, but there's no peace agreement. Nuclear deterrence, both are nuclear weapon states and are constantly threatening each other to with the potential of a nuclear strike. They could today decide that they're no longer enemies, and that would be it. So ideas, perceptions, preferences change. Looking at aliens, we should not assume a priori that we are about to be attacked the first time we encounter aliens. We don't know that. We have to have an experience first with aliens to know whether they're benign or in fact are enemies of humankind. So states only acquire selfish interest through repeated interactions with other states. These preferences can change, and in fact have changed over the course of international relations history. So constructivism here is an international system that is defined by socially constructed realities. So to understand the system, you must focus on shared rules, shared practices, meanings, shared identities, and norms. And these factors then define the interests, identities, preferences, and actions of each state in the system. By emphasizing social construction of reality, we are questioning what is frequently taken for granted. So again, looking at the reality of international relations, we have always this potential of alternative pathways that can or could have produced alternative worlds, alternative realities, and in fact, because ideas keep changing, because ideas keep having an impact on international relations, these alternative pathways have been presented to us throughout international relations history. Now, let's look at these alternative pathways. So history appears path dependent. So historical accidents, human interventions that can force history to change course. Weber says we are cultural beings with the capacity and the will to take a deliberate attitude toward the world and lend it significance. So again, constructivists here attempt to recover the meaning that actors give to their practices and the objects that they can create. Looking at Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, all of this was championed by Nasser of Egypt after decolonization. And for the most part, pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism was a shaped identity of Arabs and of Arab states, not only the domestic policies, but also the foreign policies. So pan-Arabism was primarily shaped by the idea that they all shared this identity of being Arab states. It was reactive against Israel and also against Western imperialism to a lesser extent. Now, this changed after President Sadat of Egypt, here pictured on the left, signed a peace treaty negotiated, brokered by Jimmy Carter with the Israeli Prime Minister Begin, in 1978. That was a massive taboo which nobody saw that it would come, and it broke that particular identity of Arab nationalism. Now again, looking at the picture, that's an image of the assassination of President Sadat by extremists who considered him to be betraying the Arab national cause. But this has happened throughout history. That identities, preferences, ideas change, and therefore provided an alternative pathway. Fall of the Berlin Wall, for example, 1989, triggered, was part of people power in Eastern Europe, and ended the communist era and the Cold War, of course. Now here you can see that statesmen and stateswomen are like canoeists. They go downstream. Going up the stream, paddling up the stream is difficult, is hard. It takes a lot of energy. But it does happen. History has shown us that pathways can change and that one single canoeist actually can have an impact on the course of international relations. Now, constructivists in that mindset context also assert that image is everything. Just like high school, states do care about reputation and the image. So looking at international community today, largely states do favor democracy, market economies, membership in international organizations. Now, why is that? Is it because these systems are superior? Are liberal democracies the superior governing principle, as is capitalism, as an economic system? our membership in international organizations, is that a superior way of conducting relations? Or is it because states want acceptance, legitimacy, and status as part of embracing these forms of political or economic systems? So here the reference is that states want to be part of the modern world. Looking at Iran, Iran is in charge, has the mastery of the nuclear energy cycle. It knows how to enrich uranium. It wanted to have that mastery of the entire nuclear fuel cycle because of the prestige it represents. It wants to be part of that very exclusive club, the nuclear club of states. It says it does not want nuclear weapons. And of course, that created a lot of issues, for the last decade. Negotiations, which then ended in the Iran deal, was that Iran said, we don't want nuclear weapons, but we want that prestige, we want that status. They didn't say that, but constructivists would say that it is the ultimate status symbol. That's why Iran wants it. There are plenty of other scholars who would credit Iran for wanting that for other reasons, defensive reasons, or perhaps even to build a nuclear weapon in order to dominate the region. But constructivists would largely look at what image means. So if you look at the life cycle of these norms that have the impact on conduct of international relations, we have norm emergence, norm cascade, and norm internalization. Now, norm emergence, we're looking at norm entrepreneurs. They attempt to convince a critical mass of states to embrace new norms. These states then being pressured into socializing to become norm followers. There's a good amount of peer pressure there to accept that. And also they're largely, again, coming back to the issue of image, really want, desire to enhance their legitimacy by becoming norm followers. And then norm internalization, that norms have been taken for granted quality. So if you're looking at the LGBT rights movement in the United States, just look at within the state level, that the Human Rights Campaign has been credited a lot with promoting and protecting the rights of members of the LGBT community. So this was a social movement, not only wanting to change the laws in the country, but the perception, the normative perception of Americans at large. So here society was the main target, if you like, of that social movement, rather than only legislation. Legislation was important, of course, to protect the civil rights of members of the LGBT community, but what also needed to change was the perception of Americans, of American society at large. Now, again, if you're looking at that at an international level, you could look at all human rights, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 to all other conventions on human rights. Today, you would have very few states which would say that we don't want to give voting rights to women because we don't think women ought to have voting rights. Now, there are different reasons why states, governments wouldn't say that, domestic political reasons, but constructivists would certainly also look at that life cycle that has become such a, we've reached at a third level for a case like this, that norms have been taken for granted quality. And that is the true for any normative issues we'd be looking at international relations. Now, to conclude, constructivism as an approach to international relations asserts that structural, realist, and liberal internationalist scholars fail to explain contemporary global transformation. How is it possible that international relations history has gone through these massive changes throughout? How do we explain these changes? How do we explain how ideas, in fact, contribute to global change? So world orders are created and sustained not only by great power preferences, but also by changing understanding of what constitutes a legitimate international order. So these are the main input of constructivists, that ideas and identity norms matter in international relations.